The Ohio State Buckeyes gut the Oregon Ducks. They cooked the Oregon Ducks and then ate them for dinner. Final score of 41-21 Ohio State. That's dominant, but that also doesn't describe how dominant. Because at one point in this matchup, and this is the only statistic you need to know, at one point in this matchup, Ohio State led 34-0. There may be no other game like that in terms of expected performance and expected outcome versus the outcome. There may be no other game we see in college football history when you look at the kickoff to the 2-minute warning to maybe, if you don't want to use the 2-minute warning, to halftime, where the expected outcome, not just from the general public, but even from Vegas, who favored Ohio State to win, favored them by 2.5 points, but not by the 20 points they won by, favored them versus what happened, the expectation versus the reality. The width of those two, I mean, there's a canyon separating that. I predicted Oregon to win, but only by a possession, just by a humble touchdown. I thought to myself that Oregon would once again have some success against Ohio State's defense, that Ohio State would also have success against Oregon's defense, but that ultimately Oregon would be superior in the trenches overall. And they weren't. They weren't. They were not at all. Ohio State outclassed them in the trenches, but even more importantly than in the trenches, Ohio State just came out better prepared. They changed their scheme. They adapted from the first game. Here's the difference between these two teams. Here's the big difference here. Ohio State learned their lesson. They took the punch, they adapted, and they just moved on. Oregon came out thinking they could do the same thing over and over again that they did the first time, and it didn't work. And that right there is coaching. Ryan Day, Jim Knowles, Chip Kelly did a much better job than Dan Lanning, Will Stein, and Tosh Lupoy at preparing their team for success. Period. That's it. And I think that explains a lot of the lopsidedness here. On top of the fact that now I've learned, and anyone else who hasn't, well, they should learn pretty quickly, or they have after this matchup, that Ohio State is the more talented team. They have the higher ceiling. And they played in part because of coaching, but also the individual effort of the players to their ceiling. So everything went Ohio State's way. And Ohio State controlled all the controllables. And Oregon, well, they didn't control any of the controllables. So that's why the 34-0 lead occurred. And it was just, that was impressive to me. The Tennessee win could have been explained away by just Tennessee being very overvalued, because I still think Tennessee's very overrated. But this game, this was way more impressive than anything Ohio State did against Tennessee. Much more impressive. So kudos to Ryan Day, his staff, to Brian Hartline, to Justin Fry, to Larry Johnson, to James Laurinaitis, to Tim Walton, to whatever low-level analyst is working with the special teams, because they don't have a special teams coordinator, and yet the special teams did very well. I mean, Jaden Fielding was an accurate field goal kicker. Ohio State had, all right punting. So take from that what you will. But before we get into any more of this game, and I know long-winded introduction, but I think it's important, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and also comment your thoughts down below, but most importantly, hit the notification bell. That way you get notified when I go live or release new content. Answer these questions down below. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that Ohio State wins the national championship? Number 2, how flukish do you think this game was? Because on one hand of the spectrum, I think that Oregon beating Ohio State the way they did the first time, that was maybe one extreme. But I also get the sense that this was another extreme, and that the true median outcome of like Ohio State and Oregon facing off is probably Ohio State winning by a touchdown, or maybe by 10 points. That's kind of my feeling around this game. Not saying it's flukish, though, that this was anything but a fluke, but flukish in the sense of the the 34 to nothing. How trying to find the word here. Can that be replicated? Like against Texas or against whoever Ohio State plays in the national championship if they beat Texas. What do you think about that? Tell me that down in the comment section below. And also, what changes do you think Oregon needs to make? Do you think they need to be serious coaching changes, roster changes, in-house changes? Or do you think they just got punked? Sometimes the elite teams, the good teams, sometimes they just come out and get destroyed like that. It's rare, but it's happened before. So let me know what you think Oregon needs to change down in the comment section below. By commenting, you'll enter our giveaway. The announcement to that will take place January 9th and 10th. 2 of the giveaway winners will be announced at halftime of the Cotton Bowl. The other 2 at the halftime of the Orange Bowl, where we'll be going live and doing play-by-play and color commentary. So you'll enter that giveaway. $40 total, $20 for my merchandise store gift card there, and $20 for a Visa card overall. Just wanted to let you guys know that. And also, if you want to support the channel, just look in the pinned comment and the description, and you'll find different ways to support the channel and also the link to join our Discord server. But enough of that. Let's talk about this here, this game, the Rose Bowl. Again, the final score, Oregon 21, Ohio State 41. The impact statistic here is that Ohio State had 8 sacks and 13 TFLs. I tell you that before the game. Someone tells me that before the game. I know, okay, Ohio State's blowing this team out. And they only allowed 3 TFLs. And, PFF didn't give Ohio State's O-line that impressive of a grade, and I believe it. I mean, I've been a critic of Justin Fry. I still think even after this game that Ohio State would benefit moving on from Justin Fry. My opinion of him has improved, but it is one game, and a game where Oregon... I mean, look, they defended the inside run all right. The problem is Ohio State didn't run to the inside all that much because they, made better decisions. They thought, wait, hold on a minute. We've been trying to run up the middle all year, and it really hasn't been working out, especially after Simmons went down, especially after McLaughlin went down. What if with Travion Henderson, who has 4.4, 4.3 speed, what if we ran like a stretch play? What if we did that? What if we, tried zone blocking and running to the outside instead of trying to just man ball our way through everything and prove how tough we are? What if we were actually tough, not just trying to prove it? I think that's a big difference with Ohio State's coaching, and it paid huge dividends here. 8 sacks, many of them were coverage sacks. Ohio State dominated Oregon in the trenches, but there were also moments where Oregon was holding their own water, not just with holds, but some plays where they were legitimately, protecting Gabriel well. But Gabriel, even when he had forever in the pocket, would take a sack because the coverage downfield was just so elite. He couldn't do anything. The whole operation for Ohio State was a coaching clinic. One of the best coaching jobs in an individual game that I have ever witnessed. Straight up. It was very impressive. That's the impact statistic right there. I tell you, Ohio State has 8 sacks. You know they're winning. 13 TFLs, it's the same thing. I tell you, Ohio State only allows 3 TFLs. It's not as clear, but still, given the fact that Jordan Birch returned and this Oregon defense does have legitimate playmakers on the D-line, you probably think to yourself, yeah, I'm a little bit more confident in Ohio State after knowing that. So when Ohio State dominates you in the trenches, you get dominated because that is their weakness. They have no weaknesses at wide receiver. They have no weakness at safety. Cody Simon's a beast. It's been the O-line and to a much lesser degree the D-line and tight end that have been questionable all season long. And when those position groups get you, there's no hope for you. You're dead. You'll get blown out by this Ohio State team. So we'll talk about Ohio State, but I want to breeze through Oregon here and talk about them because there are conversations to be had about the Ducks. I think that this week didn't prove this, but gave some credibility to it, a lot of credibility. The buys, contrary to my belief, and this was a part of the reason why I picked Oregon, so it also explains part of the reason why I'm wrong, the buys are not beneficial. They aren't. Now, maybe to the best coaching staff in the universe, they could be. But at the same time, when you're off for a month and you're facing a team who's played at home and won at home and is just as talented as you, they get to shake off some of that rust. They do. And many of you viewers mentioned that. So kudos to you. You deserve a cookie. Seriously. Not just a cookie, like a whole basket of the most delicious cookies that you would ever want. Or maybe if you're not a cookie guy and dessert for you is like a burger, or maybe you're a vegetarian, like whatever food you love, you deserve to have that because you guys called that. Part of the reason why this game was so lopsided is Oregon came out rusty and Ohio State was on fire. Now, I think a lot of that rust had to do with the fact that Oregon coached this game arrogantly. They clearly thought they were going to be able to do the same things. And I thought to myself that they weren't going to be able to do the exact same things. I thought they would have to be more consistent. They were going to have to use the short passing game more, the intermediate passing game more. They weren't going to get the same explosives deep over and over and over and over again because Jim Knowles had made adjustments. And while I thought maybe Oregon would get an explosive here or two, and indeed they did, I thought that Ohio State's defense would adjust and at least hold Oregon to a little more accountability, hold them a little bit more accountable than they did the first time around. I think what happened, as I mentioned earlier, is Oregon thought they could do the same thing again. It was weird. I mean, they were trying to establish the run when it clearly wasn't working. And Jim Knowles, in the same flipping way, it was an inverse of the first game with Oregon's offense and Ohio State's defense. The first time around, Will Stein outcoached Jim Knowles. Jim Knowles didn't know what he was doing. Jim Knowles may have well as been on a bench waiting for the train and he smells of alcohol. He didn't know what he was doing first time around. And Will Stein was putting on a coaching clinic and coaching circles around him. This time, Will Stein is waiting for the train, smelling of alcohol, on the bench, and Jim Knowles is in the suit. He's, tightening up his tie. He smells really good, and he's the man, and he's doing whatever he wants. And on top of that, while Oregon's offense and Ohio State's defense had completely flipped in terms of which was dominating the other, nothing had changed from the side of Ohio State's offense versus Oregon's defense. Very little. There were, of course, things that were different, like the fact that Ohio State had a lot more success going deep. But again, I think part of that was also on Oregon and their lack of preparation. Regardless of that, Ohio State's offense hummed because they made the appropriate adjustments. Ohio State's defense rebounded because they made the appropriate adjustments. Oregon already had the inferior roster, so therefore you have to out-coach Ohio State in order to beat them. You can't just coach at the same level they do and beat them, because then the talent's the tiebreaker, and that leans OSU. You have to out-coach Ohio State. And instead what happened is Ohio State rolled over Oregon like a tank rolling over a dead body on the battlefield. And it was just over. I mean, the game was over midway through the second quarter. And we're talking about the number one team. We're talking about two teams who are top 5, if not top 4. I mean, in hindsight, Oregon was very overvalued by me, by others. I know that even people I knew who strongly picked Ohio State did not think, oh my gosh, this would happen. But here we are. So it was just a very impressive showing by Ohio State. And I know I'm talking about Ohio State when I'm supposed to talk about Oregon, but how can't I talk about Ohio State? It was an absolute dominant performance. Oregon had no scores on the first 6 drives, and they had negative 23 rushing yards. They were boat raced and clearly unprepared. They were rusty. They had a moment there in the third quarter where it looked like they might come back, but again, circling back to game planning, preparation, being warmed up, they didn't have enough of those things to mount said comeback. They didn't. And also, speaking of the coaching, I've never been high on Tosh Lupoy. I wasn't even high on him this year. part of the reason why I picked Oregon incorrectly is because I thought that Ohio State had offensive elements that were just broken beyond repair, namely the offensive line. Now, I was incorrect on that with the O-line, but we'll talk more about Ohio State later because the O-line for Ohio State is still far from a strength. I just think they managed it a lot better, and they, for all the talk about Fry's lack of recruiting, which is true, that's only been really the past 2 years. They have enough bodies with enough experience to where they're not just going to roll over and die there like Colorado's offensive line in 2023. So, again, we'll get to that later. But Tosh Lupoi holds Oregon back. He was the worst coordinator on the field that day. Straight up. Far inferior to Jim Knowles, far inferior to Will Stein, inferior to Chip Kelly. I mean, they panned over to him, and he looks lost. I mean, Lanning looked lost. Stein kind of looked calm the whole day, but Lupoi looked lost. Lanning actually didn't look lost. Lanning just looked disheartened, like, oh my gosh, we're seriously losing to these guys who we beat, and they're kicking our you-know-what? But Lupoi holds Oregon back. Oregon would benefit. They would, in fact, I'll say this, even though Oregon loses a lot of production this year, they'll be better next year if they just get a better D coordinator, even with all they lose, because they're recruiting at a high enough level, developing at a high enough level, and coaching at a high enough level at multiple positions, assistant coaching-wise, offensive coordinator-wise, and head coaching-wise, to where I think they will improve next year, even with all their losses, if they simply get a better defensive coordinator. In games against playoff teams, Boise State, Ohio State twice, Penn State once, they have allowed 35 points per game, 5 touchdowns per game against playoff teams on an average basis. Could have been even more if Ohio State kept their foot on the gas. Could have been even more if James Franklin didn't James Franklin in the Big Ten championship game. In hindsight, yeah, this defense, personnel-wise, I think personnel-wise, this defense is actually pretty good. They don't have the same personnel that Ohio State does, or Penn State does, or Texas does, or Notre Dame, or any of the remaining playoff teams, or many of the teams in the CFP. But their defensive personnel is pretty good. I mean, they're a little bit small at DB, but they have athleticism, they have speed, and if they were put in better positions, they would have done better in this game. They're tough at linebacker, and they're big, athletic, and fast on the D-line. They're not perfect. They don't have the best defensive roster in the country, or now they certainly don't even have the best overall roster in the country. But scheme for them is a lot more of a problem than personnel. And with how they're recruiting, the personnel, I think, will eventually solve itself. Same with their strength and conditioning. Same with Lanning's background. Lupoi needs to go. He does. He absolutely does. Now, whether that will happen, I'm unsure. But he needs to go, for sure. And I'll leave it at that. And last but not least, and I want to I want to emphasize this, because Oregon is 13-1. They're 9-0. They were the best team in the Big Ten in the regular season in terms of achievement, in terms of strength of record. They were the number 1 seed in the playoffs, and they hold the Big Ten's best recruiting class, especially when you factor in the portal. They had a great season. I mean, Ohio State's the best program in the Big Ten in terms of blue blood status. They are. And in terms of 21st century success, they're the best. And they have been recently the favorite every year, even though they haven't won the Big Ten in 4 years now. They've been the favorites because, well, they have a great coach in Day, an elite coach, who at worst has been a near elite coach. They have a good operation overall. They recruit well. They send guys to the NFL. And Lanning beat them. He beat them. Even when Ohio State was favored to win that game. And he didn't lose to Michigan like Ohio State did, for example. And again, Ohio State won the game that mattered more, at least as long as they win it all. And I think that right now, Day has to be viewed after that win for now as a better coach than Lanning. Just does with what he did. And at the same time, Oregon had a great season. I mean, Garrison, Scarlet and Blue Scarlet and Blue show, Scarlet and Blue podcast. Check them out on YouTube. I've had Garrison on the channel before. He had high praise for Oregon. He's like, in all seriousness, I've been trolling Oregon fans about how we won the game that mattered, but the regular season matters too. And it does. Why do you think Oregon stole some recruits that Ohio State had? Some of it was the money, but I bet you another part of it was Oregon looked like the better program in the regular season. Oregon was the better coached team in the regular season. And that's even more apparent now when you factor in that Ohio State, the game they played here, Ohio State finally played to their ceiling and they blew out Oregon. Now, credit Oregon didn't play to their ceiling, but still, Ohio State is the better roster. They're the better team. And then you compare these teams in the regular season, you think to yourself, wow, like in hindsight, Oregon really was maybe even punching above their weight class there. And Ohio State definitely wasn't. So they had a good season, the Ducks did, and they need to make changes for sure, upgrades to be specific. But I don't think that Rose Bowl game should tell you that Lanning is overrated. Because Nick Saban's got blown out before. Clemson in 2018 got destroyed by Utah his second year there in 2008. He had 3 losses at Alabama's 4th year there when they brought a ton of players back. He's gotten, destroyed not just by Clemson, but like Georgia didn't destroy them by the scoreboard, but Georgia dominated them in that 2021 national championship game. They got handily beaten by Texas in 23. Michigan played like the worst game of their season in 23 and beat Alabama. Like, great coaches lose games that seem like layups, or they get destroyed by great opponents. It happens. It's happened to Ryan Day before. Look at 2020 Alabama or 2021 Michigan. And I feel like for Lanning, that was his 2020-2021 Ryan Day moment, was the Rose Bowl, where you have a good operation and you are really this close, but then you match up against a team who's found some of your weaknesses and they just exploit them to death. And there's no way you're winning that game. That was the Alabama game and the Michigan game in 2020 and 2021 for Dan Lanning, I think. And if you're Dan Lanning, what you want to do is you want to make the move now. You don't want to do, and maybe this will be rectified at the end of this year, maybe this won't even matter, but you don't want to do in some areas what Day did after 2021, where you wait to fire Parker Fleming until after 2023. You don't want to do that. You want to make the necessary changes now. Don't get to a point where Day played Michigan in 23 and it didn't matter that he called a great game. Michigan was just better, so they were going to win. Don't do that. If you're Lanning, make the necessary adjustments and just do them now. Ohio State fans who are probably eagerly watching the show will tell you that. Just make your necessary adjustments now. And they will also say that Oregon had a great season. That's why they're so ecstatic that they beat Oregon, because Oregon was the number 1 seed. There was an argument for Oregon to be the best team in the country, and it was just the fact that they were peaking at the right time and started the season low as to why they weren't analytically uber dominant, because they weren't ranked as high by FPI and these other power ratings as Notre Dame, Ohio State, Texas. Ironically enough, Oregon's now ranked below Penn State in FPI, which is just funny. And I also get it, because I think that I even said this after the Big Ten championship game, that I thought that Penn State may have had the better roster than Oregon and just lost due to coaching. I think that opinion of mine was totally vindicated and defended by what happened in the Rose Bowl. It was just that the fact that Dan Lanning's that much better of a coach than James Franklin. So even though Franklin had the better roster equipped for success in the Big Ten, and I'd say even success nationally, because I don't think Ohio State would go up 34-0 on Penn State. Just my opinion. Maybe they would have, but I don't think so. So, yeah. But that's a little bit of rambling anyway. What I really want to do is discuss something that I've discovered. I've discovered that Ryan Day overachieves in the college football playoff. And I know that because he's 3-3 in CFP games. He's beaten the number 1 team once. He has beaten the number 2 team once. And he's beaten the 9th team once. So he's beaten all teams who were ranked in the top 10 seeding wise. None of these teams were all of them were SEC or Big Ten teams, except for Clemson in 2020, who basically was like an SEC team in terms of talent. And he's 4-2 against the spread. And ever since that blowout loss to Bama in the championship game, he has been 3-0 against the spread in the playoffs. We've talked about multiple times on this channel how if Day just, executed that fake punt a little earlier against Georgia in the Peach Bowl, or if Ruggles made that field goal, his seat would be totally cool right now. His tenure would be looked upon much differently. And I think that something that I should have saw, and I didn't, and it's my fault, I was wrong, is that Ryan Day, for all the crap that he gets, and some of it is correct, but I've largely been a Day defender, so I will take credit there, is this guy overperforms in the playoffs. Like, this team performs at their peak in the postseason, in the playoffs. Of course, Cotton Bowl aside, that wasn't a playoff game. I don't think the team wanted to be there, mainly because I don't think Day wanted to be there. I thought Day thought that was maybe beneath Ohio State a bit, which I don't know if that's a problem. I mean, part of me thinks that is, but then again, that's last year, and Ohio State's in a position to win it all right now. And I think Day's a great guy. I think Day's a high character guy. I think that Day is, I've already said it, but like a good person. On top of that, he's a good coach. He's a good schemer. He's an offensive mastermind. The players want to play for him. And his 3 losses in the playoffs were to teams that had a combined record. Listen to this, a combined record of 42-1. 22 Georgia, 15-0. 20 Bama, 13-0. It's 28-0. And then 19 Clemson, 14-1. Day's 3 losses in the playoffs were to teams that had a combined record of 42-1. That is a average win percentage of 98%, rounded to the 100th place. That's insane. And keep in mind, let me tell you the quarterbacks he lost to. College Trevor Lawrence, college Mac Jones, college Stetson Bennett. That's 2 Hall of Famers right there. And Jones set the record that season for college football passer rating. So just keeping those things in mind. Also, he didn't have Jim Knowles in year 2 or year 3, so he didn't have generationally efficient defenses, although the 19 defense with Hafley was very close to that, if not that. They allowed, I think, around 13, 14 points per game, but also college football games back then were higher scoring than they were in 23 or 24 due to the new clock rules, the fact that the Meadow was, kind of going up tempo there and having as much drives as possible, whereas now, even if you didn't factor in the clock rules, the game's slowed down a bit. Just straight up, Day overachieves in the playoffs. It's a common theme. It's something that I'm going to put on my board now as kind of like an exception to the rule, where Ohio State, whether it's 22, whether it's 20, whether it is 2024, and I think it would have been this case last year. I think if Ohio State played in the playoffs last season, if they snuck in as that 4th seed, they would have rematched with Michigan in the title. They would have beaten whoever was in front of them to rematch with Michigan in the national championship. Same thing in 21, by the way. If they played Georgia in 2021 in the same setting that Bama did, they probably beat Georgia, given the matchup edges, the fact that, those amazing wide receivers against a questionable Georgia secondary would have went in Ohio State's favor. Maybe that's too bold of an opinion of mine, but Alabama did it with an inferior passing game and a Pete Golding defense that had some questions. So I just think Day overachieves in the playoffs. He knows what to do in the playoffs to have success. And to get to some other points here, Jeremiah Smith's an alien. This one will be very brief because, well, we already have known for weeks now, if not since before then, that he was an alien. I had him as an All-American caliber receiver. I think he was, to be exact, in the preseason, I had him as the 8th best receiver in college football. I think. Definitely top 10. Well, he's number 1. And he's already better than any Heartline receiver ever. After that Rose Bowl game, it's clear to me he's better than Marvin Harrison Jr. I just think that Marvin Harrison Jr. had a stronger connection with Kyle McCord than Jeremiah Smith does with Will Howard. In terms of not chemistry, but in terms of like Will Howard doesn't rely on Smith as much as McCord did on Marvin Harrison Jr. But that also could be the fact that Egbuka is healthy this year, and he wasn't healthy for all of the games last season. But Jeremiah Smith's the best wide receiver to step foot at Ohio State, to step foot in Ohio State, definitely under Ryan Day. I'd say the same under Urban Meyer. I think he's going to be the best Ohio State wide receiver ever, if he isn't on track to being that already. He has 1,224 receiving yards. He averages 17.5 yards per reception. By the way, he's not averaging that with Joe Burrow. Like, no disrespect to Will Howard, who is a top 2 quarterback in the country right now, but he's not averaging those numbers with the best NFL, with like one of the best NFL QBs in the country. He's just doing that because that's who he is. And that's not, again, disrespectful to Will Howard. It's me trying to categorize Smith in his own category because that's where he is. And he has 14 receiving touchdowns. Again, keep in mind, 14 games. He still has 2 more games left, potentially. I would favor them to beat Texas right now, the Buckeyes, but you do never know. And Texas has some things that I think they could throw at Ohio State. But still, I think Smith against Texas will do well. I think he'll do well in the national championship game if the Buckeyes do play there. He's going to do well against everyone. I think that Jeremiah Smith is the epitome of Ohio State's wide receiver room, where you can never stop them. You just have to limit them, or you have to outdo them, which now with Jim Knowles and his defense is going to be very hard to do. It's possible. Nebraska did it. Michigan did it. The latter was, I think, due to some coaching errors and a little bit with the Nebraska game too, but still, Ohio State's not invincible, but Jeremiah Smith is invincible. And it really helps Ohio State's cause to win the national championship. And also to put together one of the more impressive runs in terms of, beating top 10 opponents in a row, potentially of all time. So take from that what you will. Jeremiah Smith is an amazing player, phenomenal player. And he's humble too. A lot of some of these players at different schools do not have humility. And they kind of just like fling themselves everywhere, and it's not likable. It's kind of gross. But that's not Jeremiah Smith at all. Jeremiah Smith just kind of shrugs his shoulders like, well, this is who I am. I've worked hard for it, but it's kind of just is what it is. It doesn't make me better than everyone else. It's extremely admirable. I like him. I really do. And I like Ohio State. It's hard to root against this Ohio State team when they're functioning this way. It is. At parts of this year, at parts of last year, and this is just like me from an analyst standpoint, because I like good football. I like clean football. I like teams who go full throttle and just don't stop. And Ohio State didn't have that for any of this regular season except for maybe the Iowa game, part of the Indiana game, and the Western Michigan game. Like in 75% of the regular season games, they played very imperfect football and had a lot of critical weaknesses. It was the same part for Ohio State last season. This season, maybe even more so than last year at times, due to the fact that this team had higher expectations, and also due to the fact that this team lost to an unranked team, whereas last year's team didn't. But now that they're on, and they're playing pretty flawless consistently, it's easy to root for them, especially since they have a lot of high character guys like Jeremiah Smith, Travion Henderson, Will Howard, Emeka Egbuka, G. Scott. I think is a very selfless player. I mean, you look at Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom, Jack Sawyer, Tuimola. I mean, their stars are stars on the field, off the field, with their physicality and their physical attributes, but also their minds. I mean, this team reeks of high football IQ. And Knowles, I think, is a Jesse Minter, Phil Parker level DC. Jesse Minter last season had, I think, the best performance as a DC in the nation by a country mile. Phil Parker had that in 2022. Now, Minter's doing good work in the NFL. If he were in college this year, I think Michigan probably wins more games if he stays with them. And Phil Parker's defense had a bit of a down year this year, but still was pretty good. And it's hard to win at Iowa with the talent they have, and he's done a pretty good job. But Knowles is at that level. I mean, this team didn't just have a generational defense this year. Remember, last year they had a generational defense too. They didn't just have an elite defensive performance this postseason. They had an elite defensive performance last postseason. The offense was basically Iowa-esque in the Cotton Bowl, and Ohio State was very close to winning because their defense kept getting sacks on Brady Cook, and Missouri couldn't run the ball. They also couldn't pass the ball. So he's produced two generational defenses back-to-back. Who's to say next year's defense can't be that high of a level? Who knows if he'll maybe want to look for a head coaching job, although it's pretty late in the cycle. But also, Knowles is obviously, still in the college football playoffs. But he's an elite DC. He's one of the best, if not the best, defensive coordinator in the country. And the Rose Bowl game was the epitome of his defense because there was a lot of three down linemen, a lot of only rushing three situations. It felt a lot like his Oklahoma State defense, and also a lot more like Ohio State's defense last season than at points this season. Where last season they just sent four. They were content sitting back in coverage, and most of the sacks they got were coverage sacks because they didn't get a ton of pressure on you because they didn't send a bunch of guys, but they were just so good in coverage that the QBs would just get lost and eventually find themselves in the turf. That was the Oregon game. Ohio State rarely blitzed, and when they did, keep in mind, Oregon got some big plays off of that. So what Knowles did, and maybe part of it was the fact that the team was up so much, is they just sat back, kept everything in front of them, no explosive plays, and, well, what do you know? You shut down one of the best offenses in college football. So Ohio State right now is the best team in the country. Oregon is one of the best teams in the country. They were just outclassed by an even better Ohio State team. The Ohio State Buckeyes march on to face Texas in the Cotton Bowl, and the Ducks stay home, and they're going to figure out what they need to figure out to have a successful 2025 season. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also hit that notification bell so that way you can get notified when new content from College Football with Sam drops. I appreciate you very much, and also share the video around to others who enjoy the sport of college football and love it as I do and as you do, and comment your thoughts down below so that we can have a conversation because I want to know what you are thinking. And join our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7 via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Thank you to my Heisman Patreon members, Crash2488, Brasco Rascal, and Conlo OH. Thank you to my All-American Patreon members, Chris Lane, Ismar, and Tyler Nye. And thank you to my All-Conference members, John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus. Make sure to check out my merchandise store and or Patreon page or Super Chat down in the comment section below to support the channel. The Patreon page and merchandise store links are in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I hope you have a wonderful day. It is December, so Merry Christmas and also Happy New Year. I will see you guys soon.